I was standing by the dam my family built generations ago doing routine maintenance. I wasn't blocking anyone. I wasn't breaking any laws. That dam protects our land and controls the water for miles. Then the HOA board showed up. They said I owed unpaid fees for land they claimed was now theirs. People tried to explain the dam was private property. They didn't listen. They said HOA rules were more important than history, more important than safety. Neighbors gathered, phones came out, people warned them to stop. They didn't. What they didn't know was this: destroying the dam would put their entire neighborhood at risk, and I was the legal owner with full water rights. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from. And please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. I was standing at the edge of the dam just after sunrise, listening to the steady, controlled rush of water flowing through stone channels my family had maintained for generations. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and everything felt normal in the way things do right before they stop being normal forever. I had come out early to inspect a spillway gate that had been sticking. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. I had no idea that within hours, a group of strangers would decide they had authority over something they neither built nor understood. The dam was not decorative. It was not symbolic. It was not optional. It controlled water that fed farms, protected downstream land, and prevented seasonal flooding that once wiped out entire valleys. My great-grandfather built it after a flood destroyed half the county, and every generation since had preserved it with permits, inspections, and documented water rights. It existed long before paved roads, before subdivisions, and long before anyone had ever heard the words homeowners association. Then the SUVs arrived. They rolled in slowly, expensive tires crunching over gravel that hadn't changed in decades. Out stepped three people wearing matching polos with an HOA logo stitched proudly on the chest. Clipboards came out, phones came out. One woman, clearly in charge, looked at the dam like it was an inconvenience rather than a safeguard. She didn't ask my name. She didn't ask what I was doing. She told me I was in violation. She said the HOA had discovered unpaid fees tied to what they now claimed was community-controlled watershed infrastructure. She said the dam was obstructing water flow to their newly built development. She said the HOA board had voted to have it removed if I didn't comply. People tried to explain that the dam was private property. I explained it myself, calmly, with documents in hand. I told her the land surveys predated her entire neighborhood by nearly a century. She didn't listen. She said rules were rules. She said HOA authority overrode outdated claims. She said feelings, history, and tradition didn't matter. What mattered, she said, was compliance. Neighbors from the development began gathering at a distance, curious, confused, filming. Some of them whispered. Some asked questions. A few looked genuinely worried. One older man asked if tearing down the dam would cause flooding. The HOA woman dismissed him without turning her head. She said engineers had signed off, though she couldn't produce a single name. She said delays would result in fines. She said resistance would result in enforcement. I told her to stop. I told her removing even part of the structure, without proper engineering, would destabilize the entire system. I told her the dam was registered, inspected, and protected under state water law. I told her that altering it without authorization would put lives and property at risk. She smirked and said that if I had an issue, I could take it up in court. Phones were fully out now. People asked her to slow down. Someone suggested calling the county. Someone else suggested waiting for documentation. She didn't. She gestured toward the dam like it was trash that needed hauling away. She said contractors would arrive within the week. What she didn't know was this: that this wasn't just land I happened to own. This was land I was legally responsible for protecting. This was water I was legally entitled to control. This was infrastructure I was obligated by law to maintain safely. And this wasn't the first time someone thought power on paper meant power in reality. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. That morning ended with a violation notice taped to a post older than the HOA itself. It fluttered in the breeze like a threat written by someone who didn't understand what they were challenging. As the SUVs drove away, I stood there watching the water flow exactly as it had for decades, knowing something had shifted. Not in the river, but in the balance between arrogance and consequence. Because once people decide rules matter more than reality, the damage is never theoretical. By mid-morning, word had already started spreading beyond the gravel road that led to the dam. Messages came in from neighbors, old friends, and a county clerk who hadn't spoken to me in years, all asking variations of the same question. What is the HOA trying to do out there? That alone told me how serious the situation was becoming. People who understood this valley knew exactly what that dam meant. Even if the newcomers living uphill did not, I drove into town with a folder on the passenger seat, thick with documents that smelled faintly of dust and paper aging the honest way. Deeds, survey maps, water rights filings, state inspection reports, maintenance permits renewed again and again over decades. This was not a loose collection of claims. It was a paper trail that told a clear story. The dam existed long before the neighborhood, long before the HOA charter, long before any board had ever voted on anything in a carpeted meeting room. At the county records office, the clerk behind the counter didn't even need to look surprised. She simply sighed, the way someone does when they recognize a recurring kind of stupidity. She confirmed what I already knew. The HOA's development had been approved with explicit language, acknowledging the dam as a pre-existing structure. Their builders had signed off on it, their engineers had designed drainage systems around it, their legal team had initialed the clause. There was no ambiguity, no gray area, no loophole to exploit. Still, paperwork has never stopped people who believe authority belongs to whoever speaks the loudest. When I returned to the property, fresh tire tracks cut through the dirt near the spillway. Someone had already come back. Two men in reflective vests stood near the lower gate, pointing at bolts and concrete seams as if they were discussing furniture placement rather than structural integrity. They froze when they saw me. One of them admitted, without much prompting, that they were subcontractors hired to assess partial removal. They hadn't been told about permits. They hadn't been told about water rights. They certainly hadn't been told about downstream consequences. I ordered them to stop and leave, and this time they listened. But I knew that would not be the end of it. People who act like the HOA woman did rarely accept being wrong quietly. They escalate. They double down. They frame defiance as disobedience rather than self-preservation. And sure enough, by late afternoon, an official-looking email arrived accusing me of obstructing community improvements and threatening fines that climbed into absurdity with every paragraph. What struck me most was not the arrogance of the language, but the confidence. They truly believed that numbers on a spreadsheet outweighed physics, history, and law. They believed that because they represented a collective of homeowners, the land itself would somehow submit. They believed the dam was a nuisance rather than a safeguard, a problem rather than a solution. I spent that evening walking the structure from end to end, running my hand along stones set by men who understood gravity better than any HOA committee ever would. I checked the gates. I checked the overflow channels. Everything was stable, but stability requires respect. You cannot tear at something like this without consequences. Water does not negotiate. It does not care about votes or fines or threats. It responds only to pressure and release. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I could see the rows of identical houses in the distance, roofs catching the last light. They looked peaceful, safe, orderly. The people living there had no idea how fragile that sense of security actually was, or how much it depended on a structure they had been told was expendable. I wondered how many of them even knew their HOA was picking this fight in the first place. That night, I made copies of everything and sent certified notices to the county, the state water authority, and an attorney who specialized in land use disputes. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood something the HOA did not. When people threaten infrastructure, documentation becomes armor. You do not wait for damage before proving responsibility. The dam held steady under the stars, water flowing exactly where it should, as it always had. But beneath that calm surface, tension was building. Not in the structure itself, but in the people who believed they could control it without understanding it. And when ignorance meets entitlement, the result is never quiet. By the time I went to bed, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about fees or paperwork or pride. It was about whether experience and law would prevail over arrogance. And if the HOA pushed any further, the consequences would not be theoretical, imagined, or easily reversed. The first warning was polite, formal, and impossible to misunderstand. It came on county letterhead, stamped and signed, outlining exactly why no construction, removal, alteration, or interference of any kind was permitted near the dam without multi-layer approval. It referenced statutes, engineering assessments, and historical flood data going back more than a century. It might as well have been written in fireproof ink. Anyone reading it in good faith would have stopped immediately. The HOA board did not. Their response arrived less than 24 hours later, CC-ing half a dozen lawyers whose names were followed by impressive titles and expensive firms. The tone was firm, dismissive, and strangely offended, as if being told no by reality itself was an insult. They claimed the dam was an aesthetic hazard. They called it obsolete. They insisted it posed potential liability to the neighborhood, despite the fact that every safety report said the opposite. According to them, removing or weakening it was not only justified but necessary. What they never once addressed was water volume. That omission would have been laughable if it were not so dangerous. The reservoir fed by the dam was not decorative. It was not ornamental. It existed because gravity, rainfall, and terrain demanded it. Without controlled release, runoff from the upper slopes had only one place to go, and that place was straight through the heart of the new development. Engineers had accounted for that reality when the homes were approved. They had assumed the dam would remain exactly where it was, doing exactly what it had always done. I sent my own warning next, this one direct and unmistakable. I laid out the consequences in plain language, free of legal jargon or courtesy phrases. I explained what would happen if the spillway were compromised, how quickly water would accelerate, how little time there would be to react, and how irreversible the damage would become once it started. I told them this was not a threat. It was physics, they replied with a vote tally. According to their board minutes, the dam removal passed 5-2. They congratulated themselves on decisive leadership and accused me of fear-mongering. One board member even suggested that decades of unchecked rural infrastructure were finally being brought under civilized management. That phrase stuck with me, civilized management, as if concrete, stone, and water had somehow been weighty. For suburban approval to behave, 2 days later, machinery arrived again. This time it was heavier, louder, less cautious. An excavator positioned itself near the lower retaining wall, its steel arm swinging casually as operators discussed lunch plans. I stood at the property line with copies of injunction requests already filed, my phone recording everything. I told them to stop. I told them they were violating state law. I told them they were endangering lives. They told me they had orders. The first crack appeared just after noon. It was not dramatic. It did not explode or collapse. It was a hairline fracture, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But I knew. Anyone who understands load-bearing structures knows that water does not need a wide opening. It only needs patience. A thin, dark line traced itself along the seam where old stone met newer reinforcement, and I felt my stomach drop. I called it in immediately. So did 3 other people, judging by the dispatch chatter. County engineers were en route, but distance is cruel when water decides to move. The excavator operator shut down his machine, suddenly uncertain, suddenly very small. The HOA representative on site began shouting into her phone, demanding reassurance that everything was under control. It was not. Within an hour, seepage increased. What had been a trickle became a steady push, forcing its way through weakened material. The sound changed first. Water has a voice when it's unhappy, a low, urgent pressure that hums rather than splashes. Birds left the area. Even the wind seemed to pull back. Emergency notices went out to residents downhill, but confusion slowed everything. Some people assumed it was a drill. Others were told conflicting instructions by HOA emails insisting there was no cause for alarm. Cars clogged the narrow access roads as families tried to leave at the same time. Sirens began to echo off the hills, sharp and insistent. Then the spillway failed. When it happened, there was no explosion, no single catastrophic moment. There was a release, a surrender. The structure did not break so much as give up, and water surged forward with terrifying efficiency. It tore through landscaping like paper, lifted fences as if they were suggestions, and turned streets into channels in minutes. The identical houses that had looked so neat from a distance were suddenly fragile, their foundations exposed, their walls no match for momentum. I stood on higher ground, helpless and furious, watching something ancient assert itself against modern arrogance. This was not revenge, it was consequence. Every warning ignored had carried weight, and now that weight was moving downhill. By nightfall, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Power was out, cars were overturned, emergency crews worked through floodlit darkness, pulling people from second-story windows and rooftops. Miraculously, no lives were lost, but the damage was absolute. Homes were condemned, roads were destroyed. What had been marketed as a pristine community was now a disaster zone. And still, somehow, the HOA board insisted this was not their fault. They blamed outdated maps. They blamed extreme weather. They blamed unexpected structural behavior. Anything but their own decisions. Anything but the warnings they had dismissed as inconvenience. I listened to their statements on the news, standing ankle-deep in mud that had once been someone's living room, and felt a cold clarity settle in. This was no longer about property rights or neighborhood politics. Morning arrived without sunlight, filtered through thick clouds that hung low over the valley like a judgment that had not finished speaking. The floodwater had receded just enough to reveal the damage in full detail, and what it revealed was worse than anything the cameras had captured the night before. Streets that once had cheerful names printed on decorative signs were now gouged channels of mud and debris. Lawns were gone entirely, replaced by uneven trenches where the earth itself seemed to have been dragged downhill. The smell of wet insulation, fuel, and broken sewage lines filled the air, heavy and unmistakable. Emergency crews were everywhere. National Guard vehicles rumbled slowly through what was left of the main road, their tires sinking slightly with every rotation. Utility workers moved carefully, marking live wires and unstable poles with bright paint. Engineers walked in small groups, clipboards in hand, speaking quietly but urgently as they pointed toward the shattered remains of retaining walls and foundations that had been undermined from below. Every professional there knew the same truth: this damage was not cosmetic, and it was not easily reversible. Residents stood in shock. Some clutched soggy photo albums pulled from the wreckage. Others stared silently at the shells of their homes, unable to process how quickly stability had vanished. A few were angry, pacing back and forth, shouting into phones, demanding explanations from insurance companies that were already preparing denial language. The HOA's cheerful welcome banners still hung crookedly from light poles, their slogans grotesquely out of place amid the devastation. By mid-morning, the first official statements began circulating. The HOA board released an email addressed to valued community members, expressing sympathy while carefully avoiding responsibility. They spoke of unforeseen structural failure and acts of nature, insisting that the flooding had been impossible to predict. They promised cooperation with authorities while subtly reminding residents that individual homeowners were responsible for their own issue. Rance claims the message ended with a tone-deaf assurance that the board would rebuild stronger than before. It took less than an hour for that message to backfire. County officials held a press briefing at the edge of the damaged zone, standing in front of temporary barricades and flashing emergency lights. The lead engineer spoke calmly but firmly, explaining that the dam failure was not mysterious, sudden, or unavoidable. It was the direct result of unauthorized interference with a regulated structure. He referenced documented warnings, written notices, and recorded objections that had been ignored. He did not mention the HOA by name at first, but everyone listening knew exactly who he meant when a reporter asked whether this disaster could have been prevented. The engineer did not hesitate. "Yes," he said, "completely." That single word carried more force than any accusation shouted in anger. It stripped away excuses and left only decisions. Cameras turned toward the damaged hillside, zooming in on the scar where heavy machinery had weakened a structure designed to manage water, not defy it. Graphics appeared on the evening news, illustrating how the reservoir had been held safely for decades, how the spillway had functioned exactly as intended until it was compromised. The narrative began to shift. By afternoon, investigators arrived with warrants. They walked past the HOA representatives, who hovered nervously near the perimeter, phones pressed to their ears, voices tight with forced confidence. Equipment was photographed. Work orders were collected. Emails and meeting minutes were requested and secured. The casual authority the board members had once wielded evaporated under the weight of state oversight. Residents watched this unfold with a mixture of vindication and dread. Vindication, because the truth was finally being acknowledged. Dread, because acknowledgement did not undo loss. Children asked when they could go home. Parents did not have answers. Temporary shelters filled quickly, and relief organizations set up tables offering water, blankets, and paperwork assistance. Late in the day, the rain returned. It was not heavy, but it did not need to be. The ground was already saturated, stripped of vegetation and stability. Runoff flowed freely through newly carved paths, carrying silt and debris into areas that had somehow escaped the initial surge. Crews worked fast, reinforcing barriers and redirecting flow where possible, but the message was clear. Once control is lost, regaining it is exhausting and expensive. That evening, a second press conference was held. This time, the focus was legal. State officials outlined potential violations, ranging from environmental damage to criminal negligence. They spoke about liability, about the difference between governance and overreach, about how authority without understanding becomes dangerous. When asked whether arrests were possible, the response was measured but unmistakable. All options are being considered, the spokesperson said. The HOA board members did not attend. Instead, they issued another written statement through their attorneys, urging patience and restraint while investigations continued. The language was cautious now, stripped of confidence, full of phrases like pending review and alleged actions. Gone were the declarations of leadership. Gone was the certainty that rules, once written, could overpower reality. As night fell, I walked the edge of the property where the dam had stood, now partially collapsed and eerily quiet. The reservoir behind it was lower, calmer, as if spent after its release. Water trickled through channels carved by force, obeying gravity with the same indifference it always had. It struck me then how little emotion was involved in any of this. Water had not acted out of anger. It had not punished anyone. It had simply moved where it was allowed to move once the barriers were weakened. Control had been an illusion. The HOA believed authority meant dominance. They believed paperwork could override terrain, and votes could override engineering. They believed that because they had the power to demand compliance, they also had the wisdom to reshape systems they did not understand. That belief had dissolved as completely as the soil beneath their development. Sirens echoed again in the distance as crews continued working through the night. Generators hummed. Floodlights cast harsh shadows across broken ground. Somewhere nearby, a child cried softly, exhausted and confused. An older couple sat side by side on folding chairs, holding hands, staring at nothing. This was the cost of arrogance. And as investigations deepened, as accountability moved closer, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone watching. When you tamper with forces older and stronger than your authority, you do not win. Accountability did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, deliberately, and with a weight that could no longer be ignored. In the days following the flood, the neighborhood existed in a strange suspension between disaster recovery and legal reckoning. Cleanup crews worked side by side with investigators, and every shovel of mud removed from a living room seemed to uncover another layer of responsibility buried beneath it. The air buzzed constantly with generators, helicopters, and whispered conversations that stopped whenever an official walked by. The first formal notices went out within 48 hours. State environmental agencies issued violation letters citing unauthorized alteration of regulated water infrastructure. County officials followed with their own findings, documenting how the HOA had acted outside its jurisdiction, ignored recorded warnings, and bypassed required inspections. Each notice referenced specific dates, emails, and meeting minutes, painting a timeline that left little room for denial. What had once been brushed off as community enforcement was now labeled something far more serious: negligence. Insurance companies moved quickly, and not in the way residents hoped. Claims were reviewed, adjusted, and then quietly denied under clauses related to preventable damage and third-party liability. Letters arrived stamped with formal language explaining that the flooding was not the result of an unavoidable natural disaster, but of human action taken without proper authority. The implication was devastating. Homeowners who had paid premiums for years suddenly found themselves caught between loss and litigation. Unsure who would ultimately bear the cost, that uncertainty turned into anger. Town hall meetings grew tense. Folding chairs filled school gyms and community centers as residents demanded answers from anyone willing to stand at the microphone. Former HOA board members tried to speak at first, but their words were drowned out by boos and shouts. Neighbors who had once trusted them now demanded resignations, refunds, and explanations. People wanted to know who had signed the demolition orders, who had hired the contractors, and who had dismissed the warnings so casually. The paper trail answered those questions with brutal clarity. Emails surfaced showing board members acknowledging the risks and choosing to proceed anyway. Meeting notes revealed that legal counsel had advised caution, only to be ignored in favor of asserting authority. Contractors testified that they had raised concerns and been told the HOA had handled the legal side. Each statement added another link in a chain that led directly back to the same small group of decision-makers. Within a week, resignations began. First, the treasurer stepped down, citing personal reasons. Then the secretary followed, releasing a carefully worded apology that avoided admitting fault. Finally, the HOA president resigned under pressure, her departure announced through an attorney rather than in person. The board, once so confident and visible, dissolved almost overnight, leaving behind a vacuum filled by auditors, attorneys, and court-appointed administrators. Legal proceedings moved forward on multiple fronts. Civil lawsuits were filed by homeowners, insurers, and neighboring landowners affected by downstream damage. Environmental penalties were assessed for habitat disruption and water contamination. Criminal investigations examined whether falsified documents or willful disregard for safety standards crossed legal thresholds. Each process moved at its own pace, but together they formed an inescapable reality. This was no longer about rules or fees. It was about consequences. Media coverage intensified. National outlets picked up the story, drawn by the combination of human loss and institutional failure. Experts were brought on to explain how dams function, why water management is governed so strictly, and how small changes can trigger massive outcomes. The HOA became a cautionary tale, its name synonymous with overreach and incompetence. Commentators spoke less about the flood itself and more about the mindset that caused it, warning viewers about the dangers of authority untempered by expertise. Amid all of this, restoration efforts continued. Engineers developed plans to rebuild the dam under state supervision, incorporating modern reinforcements while respecting the original design. Environmental specialists monitored water quality and wildlife impact. Funding was secured through emergency programs and restitution orders, ensuring that repairs would not depend on volunteer goodwill alone. The process was slow, meticulous, and expensive, but it was guided by professionals who understood what was at stake. For residents, the emotional toll was harder to repair. Some families chose not to return, selling damaged properties at steep losses just to move on. Others stayed, determined to rebuild but forever changed by the experience. Trust, once broken, did not come easily. Community meetings shifted in tone, focusing less on aesthetics and more on transparency. Questions were asked now, not silenced. Documents were read, not waved away. The illusion of unquestioned authority was gone. As court dates were set and restitution amounts calculated, a strange calm settled over the area. It was not peace, but acceptance. People began to understand that justice rarely arrives with dramatic flair. It comes in filings, hearings, and judgments. It comes through accountability, not revenge. The flood had taken homes, memories, and security, but it had also stripped away arrogance and replaced it with hard lessons written in water and stone. Standing near the reconstruction site weeks later, it was impossible not to reflect on how easily this could have been avoided. One pause, one consultation with an engineer, one decision to listen instead of dominate. The cost of ignoring those steps was now measured in millions, in displacement and in reputations that would never recover. Accountability had arrived, not as punishment alone, but as a warning. Power, when divorced from understanding, does not protect anyone. It exposes them. By the time the final court filings were stamped and the last emergency barriers were removed, the neighborhood no longer felt like the same place. What once had been marketed as a pristine, tightly governed community now carried an invisible weight, a quiet reminder of how fragile order becomes when it is built on arrogance instead of understanding. The streets were repaired, the houses restored as much as money could allow, but something fundamental had shifted. People moved more slowly. Conversations carried caution. Trust was no longer assumed. The rebuilt dam stood firm again, stronger and more carefully engineered than before, its reinforced spillways designed to handle far more pressure than it would likely ever face. State inspectors signed off on every phase of construction, documenting each layer, each test, each safeguard. Where the HOA once acted on impulse, the new process was deliberate, transparent, and rooted in expertise. The contrast could not have been clearer. Former HOA board members faded quietly from public view. Some moved away entirely, others remained but avoided meetings and public spaces, their presence a reminder of decisions they could not undo. Lawsuits followed them for years, settling into long-term payment plans and judgments that reshaped their futures. There were no dramatic scenes, no public apologies shouted into microphones. Accountability did not need spectacle. It had already done its work. Residents learned lessons as well. They learned that authority should always be questioned when it dismisses evidence. They learned that confidence is not competence, and that paperwork does not replace physics. They learned that systems older than any neighborhood, water, land, gravity, do not negotiate. Most importantly, they learned that silence enables damage just as surely as action does. Many admitted later that they had doubted the HOA's decisions, but trusted the board to know what they were doing. That trust had been misplaced. The community reorganized under a new framework, one that limited centralized power and required external review for major decisions. Engineers, environmental specialists, and legal advisors were consulted before any action that affected shared infrastructure. Rules still existed, but they were grounded in law and reality rather than ego. The word authority was replaced with responsibility, and that shift changed everything. Looking back, it became painfully obvious how small the original conflict had been. A claim of unpaid fees, a demand for control, a refusal to listen. From those simple beginnings came a chain reaction that displaced families, destroyed property, and reshaped lives. No one had intended catastrophe, but intention had never mattered. Impact did. The dam, quiet once more, became a symbol of that truth. It did not threaten, it did not warn, it simply existed, doing its job when respected and failing when undermined. Nature had not acted out of malice. It had responded exactly as expected once safeguards were removed. The disaster was not a surprise to those who understood it. It was inevitable. Years later, new residents would move in, drawn by rebuilt homes and fresh landscaping. Some would hear the story, in fragments, passed along during casual conversations or mentioned in local articles. Others would never know the full extent of what had happened beneath their feet. But the records would remain, the court decisions would stand, and the land would remember. The final lesson was not written in law books or engineering manuals. It was written in humility. Power does not come from titles or boards or bylaws. It comes from knowledge, restraint, and the willingness to listen when warned. Those who ignore that lesson may feel strong for a moment, but reality is patient. It waits. And when it moves, it does so without concern for pride, position, or paperwork. That was the lesson they learned too late.